She stood in a room full of diamonds and designer gowns, and they still made her feel like the help. Amani Brooks, the wife of the most feared man in the country, was publicly humiliated in front of hundreds of powerful guests while her husband was thousands of miles away. And she said nothing. She smiled. She endured it, because she loved him more than she loved herself. But love has limits, and silence has a breaking point. What this family did to her in secret, caught on camera, every single frame, will make your blood run cold. Stay with me until the very end, because what Kang-woo does when he finds out will leave you breathless. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning Seo Kang-woo left for Tokyo, the mansion changed. It didn't happen loudly. It never did. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no declarations of war. It was quieter than that, more surgical, more deliberate. A shift in temperature that Amani Brooks had learned to feel in her bones the moment her husband's black SUV disappeared through the iron gates at the end of the estate driveway. She stood at the second-floor window watching the convoy leave. 3 vehicles, tinted glass, no plates. The kind of exit that told the world this man moved through life untouchable. And in a way, he did. Seo Kang-woo was not a man you challenged. He was not a man you lied to. He was not a man you crossed twice, because there was rarely a second time with men like him. But he was also not a man who was home very often. Imani pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass and stayed there until the last vehicle vanished around the bend. Then she exhaled, slowly, the way you exhale when you know something is coming and you are simply trying to prepare your lungs for it. Behind her, the bedroom was immaculate, white orchids on the nightstand, his half of the closet still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, cedar, black pepper, something almost cold, like winter air off the Han River. She had learned that scent the way a person learns a language, by total immersion, until it lived inside her without effort. She turned away from the window. By the time she reached the bottom of the grand staircase, Madame So was already seated in the main receiving room, spine perfectly straight, teacup balanced in her fingers like a prop in a play she had been rehearsing for decades. 2 women flanked her, Seo Hyun-ja, Kang-woo's older sister, in a cream blouse with her hair pinned back so tightly it looked punishing, and Park Ji-soo, a cousin by blood and a viper by temperament, who had the particular gift of smiling while she destroyed you. None of them looked up when Amani entered the room. That was the first move. It always was. Amani crossed to the breakfast table by the east window, poured herself a coffee, and sat down. She kept her back straight. She kept her expression neutral. She had learned that much. How to wear stillness like armor, how to refuse to give them the twitch of discomfort they were fishing for. The orchids in the east corridor are wilting, Madame Seo said, still not looking at her. Her Korean was slow and perfectly enunciated. The household translator, a young woman named Rena, stood near the doorway and rendered it into English, though everyone in that room knew Amani had been studying Korean for nearly 2 years and understood more than she was credited for. Someone should have attended to them yesterday. No one was looking at Amani, but the remark was aimed precisely at her, like an arrow loosed in a crowded room designed to find one specific target. Amani took a sip of her coffee. I'll speak to the groundskeeper this morning. The groundskeeper reports to the household manager, Hyun-ja said, picking up a piece of toast without glancing up. Not to guests. The word landed the way it was meant to. Guests. 2 years of marriage, 2 years inside this house, this life, this family that Kang-woo had brought her into with his hands cupped around her face and his voice rough with something she had never heard from a man before. Not desperation, not ownership, but something closer to reverence. And his sister still used that word. Guests. Amani set her cup down. She did not flinch. She did not flush. She said, of course, and she meant nothing by it except that she was still in the room and she was not leaving. Park Ji-soo finally looked at her. Her smile was warm and horrible. Did you sleep well, Imani-si? The West Wing can be drafty this time of year. We've been meaning to have the heating adjusted, but you know how long these things take. The West Wing. She had been moved to the West Wing 3 months ago under the pretense of renovations to the master bedroom, renovations that Amani had never been informed of and that Kang-woo had never mentioned. She hadn't told him about the move. She didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like what it was. "It's fine," she said. "Such grace," Jisoo murmured, tilting her head. "Kangwoo always said you were adaptable." Madame Seo finally looked at Amani then. Her gaze was not cruel exactly. It was colder than cruelty, more controlled. It was the gaze of a woman who had decided the outcome of a situation long before the situation had presented itself and was now simply watching the clock run down. "My son is a sentimental man," she said. "He always has been. Even as a boy, he brought home things he found, broken birds, stray animals, things that needed to be saved." She lifted her teacup. "He outgrew most of them." Amani looked at Madame So for exactly 3 seconds. Then she rose, gathered her coffee, and walked out of the room at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate and communicated precisely one thing. She was leaving because she chose to, not because she had been dismissed. In the hallway, out of sight of the receiving room, she stopped and pressed her back against the wall. The cold marble was solid behind her shoulders. She breathed in, out, in again. She didn't cry. Not yet. She was not by nature a soft woman, though people looked at her warmth and her work in humanitarian aid and assumed gentleness was the whole of her. She had grown up in the south side of Chicago in a house where the heating sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, raised by a mother who fought for everything and apologized for nothing, and she had carried that into every room she had ever entered. She was not fragile. She was not naive. She had walked into this marriage knowing exactly what Seo Kang-woo was, knowing the weight of what his name carried, and she had chosen him anyway, chosen him with her eyes open and her feet planted. What she had not fully calculated was his family. She pushed off the wall and moved through the corridor toward the garden entrance. She needed air. She needed distance from the sound of Jisoo's laugh drifting after her through the marble halls, light and satisfied the way a laugh sounds when it belongs to someone who has just drawn blood and knows it. Outside, the estate grounds stretched in every direction. Manicured hedgerows, a stone fountain at the center of the east garden, the long greenhouse at the far edge of the property where Amani had spent more hours than she would ever admit, among the orchids and the humidity and the quiet, because it was the one place in this estate where no one had claimed territory yet. She had been working on the humanitarian initiative for nearly a year, a collaboration between 3 international NGOs focused on displaced women across Southeast Asia. Kang-woo had helped fund it, quietly, through channels that didn't invite questions, which was exactly how he did most things. He had read her proposal once, on a Tuesday evening, when she'd brought it to him half-finished and bracing herself for skepticism, and instead he had taken the folder from her hands, sat down in the chair by the window, and read the entire thing without looking up. When he finished, he had said simply, "Tell me what you need." She had needed, it turned out, quite a lot. She sat on the stone bench near the fountain and pulled out her phone. 3 messages from her colleague Deanna back in Chicago. 2 about logistics for the Hanoi field visit. 1 that was just a voice memo of Deanna's 6-year-old singing a song about butterflies. Imani pressed play on the last one and sat with her eyes closed, and her face turned toward the pale morning light filtering through the clouds. She thought about calling Kang-woo. She thought about it the way she thought about a lot of things lately, with longing and with restraint in equal measure, the 2 feelings braided together so tightly she could no longer separate them cleanly. She did not call him. He had enough. He always had enough to carry. The Tokyo negotiations were delicate. She understood that, even without understanding the specifics. She knew the cadence of his stress by now, knew when his shoulders carried more than usual, knew the particular silence at dinner that meant something was in motion that he couldn't tell her about and wouldn't burden her with. And she loved that about him, his quietness, his protection of her from the uglier parts of what he managed. But she also understood with a clarity she sometimes wished she didn't have, that his protection had a blind spot. He couldn't protect her from the people he trusted. She sat by the fountain for 40 minutes. Then she went inside and spent the rest of the morning in her office working on the proposal revision, listening through the wall to the sound of servants being redirected away from her wing on the household manager's orders. An order she knew had not come from Kang-woo, and whose origin she didn't have to guess at. By afternoon, Rena appeared at her door, visibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Seo," she said, and there was a pause in the way she said it, a hesitation so slight anyone else might have missed it. "Madame Seo has requested the dining schedule be adjusted. Dinner will be served in the east dining room for the family at 7. For you. She's asked that a tray be sent to your office. Amani looked up from her laptop. She looked at Rena, who was 23 and kind and was currently examining a spot on the floor with deep focus. Set my place in the east dining room, Amani said. She was very set my place. Rena nodded and left quickly. Amani sat back in her chair. Her laptop screen still showed the draft of the Hanoi proposal. She stared at it without reading it for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do when a house was slowly trying to convince her she was invisible. She made herself undeniable. Dinner that evening was a particular kind of theater. She arrived at exactly 7, dressed simply. A deep burgundy dress that Kang Woo had chosen for her on a trip to Milan. Though she hadn't planned it that way, it was simply the dress that had been clean and pressed, and she walked to her seat with the same deliberate calm she'd cultivated all day. Madame Seo didn't acknowledge her entrance. Hyun-ja was mid-sentence in a conversation with Ji-soo about a charity foundation dinner the following week, and neither woman paused. Two of the older Kong cousins, men in their 50s, who Amani had never been properly introduced to despite nearly 2 years of shared family gatherings, sat at the far end of the table and spoke to each other in low voices. A servant started to pull out Amani's chair, and then, visibly, stopped. Looked at something behind her. She turned to find the household manager giving a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The servant stepped back. Amani pulled out her own chair. She sat down. She unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap. I don't remember approving this seating arrangement, Madame Seo said finally, not to Amani specifically, but to the table, as though the table had made an error of judgment. I'm Kang Woo's wife, Amani said. She said it without heat, without apology. Just the fact of it. My seat is at this table. Madame Seo looked at her then, fully, and in that look was something Amani had not seen before. Not contempt exactly, though contempt was part of it. It was something more measured. The look of someone recalibrating, adjusting their assessment of a target that had, contrary to expectations, refused to move. Children who are not part of the bloodline, Madame Seo said quietly, placing her chopsticks with precision, have always been made aware of their station in this family. The table was absolutely silent. I'm not a child, Amani said, and I'm not a guest. It was the most she had ever said in direct confrontation, and the silence that followed it had a different texture than the silences she had endured before. It was charged. It was witnessed. 3 servants near the wall were frozen in place, each of them making a careful study of the middle distance. Ji-soo broke it with a light laugh. Kang Woo really has found himself a spirited one. She lifted her wine glass. How charming! The rest of the dinner passed in brittle civility, and no one spoke to Amani. And she ate every course, and she did not rush, and when it was over she walked back to her wing and closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed in the drafty quiet of the west wing with her hands in her lap, and only then, in the privacy of that empty room, did she let herself feel the full weight of what she was enduring. She picked up her phone. She almost called him again. She put it back down. 3 days later, the invitation arrived. Not delivered to her. Delivered to the household, addressed to the Kong family, with a note in Madame Seo's hand added to the copy posted on the family announcement board that read, Immediate family only. Kang Woo has already been informed and has approved the guest list. The Kang Family Legacy Gala, held annually at the Grand Meridian Ballroom in the city. Politicians, judges, CEOs, the quiet men who moved money in ways that didn't appear in newspapers, and the Kang family, displayed in their full constellation of power and tradition. Amani read the note twice. Then she took it off the board, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She spent the next 2 hours in her office trying to get Kang Woo on a call. Tokyo, time difference, negotiations. And when she finally reached him, the connection was poor and he was between meetings, and she could hear the exhaustion in his voice, that particular flatness that lived behind his eyes when he was running on too little sleep and too much pressure. The gala, she said. I got the note about the guest list. A pause. The sound of a door closing on his end. What note? She told him. He was quiet for a moment that stretched. Amani, you're my wife. You go to the gala. Your mother said, You go. I'll have my assistant confirm it tonight. She exhaled. Okay. Imani. His voice changed slightly. Lower, more direct, the way it got when he wanted her to hear something beyond the words. I see you. She closed her eyes. I know. I'll be back by Saturday at the latest. I know, she said again. And then the connection wavered, and they lost each other, and she sat holding the phone in a room that felt very far from anything she had ever called home. The gala was in 4 days. She didn't know yet what was going to happen there. She should have known. She had been in this house long enough to know that when the CO women planned something, they planned it thoroughly, and they planned it for an audience, and they did not leave outcomes to chance. But she didn't know. And so she spent the next 4 days doing what she always did. She worked, she endured, she held herself together with both hands, while somewhere in the east wing of the mansion, behind closed doors, over cups of perfectly brewed tea, a performance was being prepared for an audience of hundreds, and the star of that performance was going to be Imani Brooks. She just didn't have her script yet. The dress arrived on Thursday morning. Imani hadn't ordered it. It appeared on the bed in the west wing, laid out with careful precision, the kind of precision that communicates contempt more effectively than carelessness ever could. It was beige, not ivory, not cream, not the kind of pale gold that catches light and becomes something. Beige, the color of waiting rooms and bureaucratic forms and women who are meant to disappear into the background of someone else's photograph. A card was attached, no signature, just 4 words in Korean, which Rena translated with her eyes aimed at the floor. Appropriate for a guest. Imani picked up the dress, held it at arm's length for exactly 3 seconds, and set it back on the bed. Then she opened her own closet and removed the gown she had already chosen. Deep emerald silk, structured at the shoulder, the kind of garment that didn't ask permission when it entered a room. Kang Woo had seen her in it once, at a function in Geneva before they were married, and had looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided he is not leaving without. She hung it on the door hook and went to take her shower. By the time Friday evening arrived, the mansion was operating with the controlled urgency of a military campaign. Florists, caterers, additional household staff imported for the evening, cars arranged in the courtyard in order of hierarchy. Madame Seo's head of personal staff had distributed a printed schedule to every member of the family, arrival order, seating assignments, photographer positions for the family portrait at 9:15. Imani had not received a copy. She learned this when she crossed Jisoo in the upper hallway at 6 in the evening, both of them dressed, and Jisoo glanced at the emerald gown with the particular look of a woman encountering a problem she had anticipated and prepared solutions for. "You're wearing that," Jisoo said. Not a question. "I am," Imani said. Jisoo tilted her head. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished to a degree that removes all traces of origin. "You know how Madame So feels about the family presenting a cohesive image. She chose a color palette for tonight. She sent me a beige dress with a note calling me a guest." Jisoo smiled. She was being practical. "So am I," Imani said, and she moved past her toward the staircase. The Grand Meridian Ballroom was 40 minutes from the estate, in the glass and steel district where the city kept its most presentable face. The Kang convoy arrived in 3 cars, and the seating assignments inside those cars told the whole story without a single word being spoken. Madame Seo, Hyunja, and the 2 senior cousins in the first car, Jisoo and 2 younger cousins in the second, Imani in the third, alone, with a driver who did not make conversation and a city sliding past the tinted windows like a film she was watching from a very great distance. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight, and she breathed, in, out. She thought about Kang Woo. She thought about the sound of his voice on that broken phone connection. "I see you." And she held on to it the way you hold on to something small and solid when the water is rising. The Meridian's entrance was a cascade of light and engineered grandeur. Cameras, guests, and architecture-level wealth, security personnel indistinguishable from executives. The Kang family was announced and received with the kind of deference that belongs to people who have redefined the difference between power and its performance. Imani stepped out of the third car alone. No one from the family turned to walk with her. No one fell back to acknowledge her arrival. They moved toward the entrance as a unit, Madame Seo at the center, flanked by her children and relatives, and the gap between that unit and the woman in the emerald gown was visible to anyone who was paying attention. Several people were paying attention. A photographer from one of the society publications caught it. Amani saw the lens turn toward her for a half second and then redirect toward the family cluster. She kept walking. She kept her chin level. She entered the ballroom with her own hands free and her own name on the guest list and absolutely no one beside her. And she found her place card and sat down at a table that turned out to be, on examination, positioned 3 rows back from the family table. Close enough to claim proximity, far enough to establish distance. The card read, Mrs. I. Brooks. Not Mrs. Seo, not Amani Seo, Mrs. I. Brooks. Her maiden name deployed like a quiet verdict. She turned the card over, set it face down on the table, adjusted her silverware, smiled at the man across from her, a gray-haired judge she'd met twice before at Kang Woo's side, who had always been polite to her with the slightly cautious courtesy of a man who understood whose wife she was and took that seriously. He glanced at the family table, then back at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not sympathy exactly, more like the silent registration of information that a careful man stores away without comment. Mrs. Seo, he said, using the correct name, deliberately. You look well. Thank you, Judge Lim, she said. How is your wife? They talked for 12 minutes about a legal reform initiative she'd read about in the news, and during those 12 minutes, Amani did not look once at the family table, though she was aware of it at all times the way you're aware of a sound you're pretending not to hear. The evening built the way these evenings always built, cocktails and ambient music transitioning into formal dinner, the room assembling itself into its hierarchies through the invisible choreography of seating and proximity and who pulled out whose chair. Speeches would come after dinner. The family portrait was scheduled for 9:15. Amani ate. She spoke with the people at her table. An NGO director from Busan who knew her work, a corporate attorney who'd been at the Kang Foundation's last fundraiser. She drank 1 glass of wine. She was present, she was composed, and some very controlled part of her was counting the hours. At 8:45, Madame Seo rose from the family table and moved through the room with her attendants, 2 of the younger female cousins at her flanks, moving the way a school of fish moves, all in response to the same central current. She stopped to speak with a senator, with the CEO of a shipping conglomerate, with a woman whose family name Amani recognized as one of the 3 wealthiest in the country, and then she stopped in the center of the room, positioned with the precise spatial awareness of a woman who understood sightlines, and raised her voice just enough, to carry. We are so fortunate tonight, Madame Seo said to the group around her. 8 people, maybe 10, but positioned in a room acoustically designed to carry sound, so that the words traveled further than they appeared to be intended to. The Kang family has always understood the importance of legacy, of protecting what has been built across generations, of knowing, truly knowing, what belongs and what does not. Amani's fork was in her hand. She set it down. Some people, Madame Seo continued, her voice remaining conversational, warm even, the warmth of a winter fire that you only later realize has been set to burn something specific, can wear beautiful things, can enter beautiful rooms, and still, no matter what they wear, no matter how far they have traveled, they cannot change what they are, or where they come from. The group around Madame Seo laughed lightly, comfortably, the laugh of people who were certain they were among their own. Amani was looking at the tablecloth. She was looking at the precise weave of the linen, the way the candlelight moved across the white surface in small ripples, and she was breathing carefully through her nose because her jaw was tight, and her hands were flat on the table, and she was using every mechanism she had ever developed, in Chicago, in the field, in 2 years of this house, in the long education of loving a man whose world did not know how to hold her, to stay in her seat. Judge Lim, across the table, had gone very still. The NGO director from Busan was examining his wine glass. Nobody at her table spoke. Madame Seo's voice found its conclusion with the ease of someone completing a well-rehearsed monologue. Some people can wear expensive dresses, but they will never become family. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. In a room where half the guests were trained by profession or survival to absorb information quickly, those words landed in the specific silence of a room that had just understood what it was witnessing. A few guests near the family table laughed again, nervous, reflexive, the laughter of people caught in a current they hadn't chosen. Others went quiet. Others looked away. And Amani Brooks, wife of Seo Kang-woo, sat at her table with her hands flat and her face composed and felt something inside her chest crack along a line that had been fracturing for 2 years. She didn't make a scene. She had never made a scene. That was not who she was, and she refused to let this place, these people, this carefully constructed campaign of diminishment make her into someone she didn't recognize. She rose from the table. She excused herself to Judge Lim with 3 words, "Excuse me, please." And she walked from the ballroom at the same deliberate pace she had walked every corridor of that estate for 2 years. And she found the hallway, and then a side exit. And then she was outside in the cool night air of the hotel's private garden, moving without a destination, moving because staying still was no longer possible. The garden was long and geometric, low hedges, stone paths, a fountain at the far end that was running, though no one was there to appreciate it. She followed the path without thinking and found herself standing at the glass door of a greenhouse attached to the hotel's rear wing, its interior lit in the diffuse amber of grow lights, warm from 20 feet away. She pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and alive, humid, green, the smell of soil and flowers, and something growing that had nothing to do with the world on the other side of that glass door. She walked to the center of the greenhouse, between rows of white orchids and trailing jasmine, and she stopped, and she pressed both hands to her face, and she cried. Not the polished kind of crying that photographs well, the ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below language, from a place in the body that has been compressed for too long under too much weight, and releases without warning in the way that compressed things always eventually release, without grace, without permission, without care for who might be watching. She stood in the middle of those white orchids, and she let it happen because there was no one there to see it, and she had nowhere left to put it, and she was so tired. Not the tired that sleep fixes, but the tired that settles into the structural parts of a person, into the joints and the marrow, the tired of 2 years of waking up every morning and choosing dignity in a house that had decided it did not belong to her. She cried until she couldn't anymore. Then she stood with her palms pressed to her wet face in the warm amber light, breathing. She heard a sound outside the greenhouse door. Voices. Female voices. She recognized them both before she fully parsed the words. Jisoo first, then Hyun-ja, the sound of heels on the stone path outside, and the particular pitch of their voices when they believed they were not being overheard. She stepped back between 2 rows of orchids instinctively and stood without moving. She didn't fall apart, Hyun-ja said. The door was glass. Their voices came through cleanly. I thought she'd make a scene. She almost did. Jisoo. Did you see her hands on the table? She was gripping the edge. I was watching her. A small, satisfied sound. She's breaking. Not fast enough. Hyun-ja's voice had a different quality than Jisoo's. Less amused, more impatient, with the edge of a woman who has waited for something for a long time and finds the waiting irritating. 2 years, Jisoo. 2 years, and she's still here. She should have left by now. She won't leave on her own, Jisoo said. Women like that, they hold on. It's the type. They think endurance is the same as love. She paused. But we don't need her to leave on her own. We need her to become something Kang-woo can't defend. Mother's been patient, Hyun-ja said. But she's done. After tonight, after the senator and his wife saw what happened, the story will move. People will talk. The right people. And what story is that? That she's unstable. That she left the gala in the middle of dinner without explanation. That she's been struggling with the cultural adjustment. That she spends most of her time in isolation. Jisoo's voice was smooth and methodical, the voice of someone reciting a plan that has been constructed with care. That she drinks. Silence. Then Hyun-ja. Does she? 1 glass of wine at dinner, Jisoo said. But that's not what people will remember. They'll remember what they're told to remember. Another pause. Heels shifted on stone. How long has this been planned? Hyun-ja asked. Since before the summer, Jisoo said. Mother started laying the groundwork in March. The servants, the seating arrangements, the West Wing. It all feeds the same narrative. An unstable foreign woman in over her head, slowly unraveling, becoming a liability to the Kang name. A light, almost admiring tone. By the time Kang-woo comes home from enough of these trips, the picture will be painted. He won't have to choose to believe it. He'll simply have absorbed it. And if he doesn't? He's already starting to, Jisoo said. Haven't you noticed how he asks about her when he calls? He's asking because he's starting to wonder. Wondering is the first step. We just have to keep feeding the right details to the right people. Yeonja made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the release of something held. She's crying in there, isn't she? Amani's entire body went cold. Probably, Jisoo said. Let her. By the time she comes out, the family portrait will be done. She won't be in it. A pause. She was never going to be in it. Their voices moved away along the path, the sound of heels fading back toward the hotel entrance. Amani stood between the orchids and the amber light, not breathing. She had known it was deliberate. She had known it at the level of instinct, the level where a body registers threat before the mind has organized the evidence. But knowing at the level of instinct and hearing it stated with that kind of precision, the planning, the timeline, the specific mechanics of a campaign designed not merely to humiliate her, but to systematically erode her husband's perception of her until there was nothing left worth defending. Those were different things. The distance between them was the distance between a bruise and a wound. March. They had started in March. She went back through the months in her mind. The move to the West Wing in April, the servants being redirected in May, the escalation at dinners through June and July, the increasingly deliberate public humiliations at social gatherings through the summer, not impulsive cruelty. Architecture. A building constructed with intention and patience, one stone at a time, designed to collapse around her so gradually that even she would begin to wonder if she was the cause of her own undoing. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Her phone was in her clutch. She pulled it out. The screen showed 2 missed calls from Kang Woo's assistant, probably checking on her absence from the ballroom. She scrolled past them and opened the call log and found his number, and her thumb hovered over it for a long time in the warm amber quiet of the greenhouse. She thought about Jisoo's voice. He's already starting to wonder. She thought about every conversation where she'd told him things were fine, every time she'd said she was adjusting, every time she'd chosen to protect him from the truth, because she didn't want to force him to choose between her and his blood, not knowing that the choice was already being made for him, one planted detail at a time, by people who had decided the outcome before she'd ever unpacked a single suitcase in that West Wing room. She had been protecting him from a war he didn't know was already being fought. Her thumb pressed the call icon. It rang 3 times. 4. Then his voice, rough with sleep, which meant it was past 2 in the morning in Tokyo, which meant she was waking him, which meant she was about to do the thing she had spent 2 years refusing to do. Amani. Immediate alertness. He never sounded fully asleep when she called. What's wrong? Not a question. A man who spent his life reading rooms had learned to read her voice the same way. She opened her mouth. She had 1,000 words ready. The greenhouse, Jisoo's voice, the plan that had been running since March, the family portrait she had been excluded from, the word guest used like a blade across 2 years of dinners and hallways. All of it was there, organized and waiting. She said, I need you to come home. 3 seconds of silence. Tokyo, 3 a.m. A man who managed criminal empires and negotiated with people who measured loyalty in the kind of currency that left no paper trail. I'm on the first flight, he said. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask her to explain or quantify or justify. He just said it, flat and certain. And in those 4 words was everything she had been trying to hold on to for 2 years. The proof that the man she had chosen was not the same creature as the family he'd been born into. She said, Okay. Stay on the phone with me. I can't, she said. Not yet. Her voice was not steady. She needed it to be steady before she went back into that ballroom to retrieve her wrap and her dignity and whatever remained of the evening. He was quiet for a moment, then, Imani, whatever happened tonight, I need you to know something. Kang Woo, I need you to hear this. His voice had dropped to the register he used when something mattered beyond the range of his usual precision. I have known something was wrong. I have known it for longer than I want to say out loud right now, and I have been... A pause that cost him something. I have not been home enough. That is on me. She closed her eyes. I'm coming home, he said. Don't do anything. Don't say anything. Just be safe tonight. Can you do that? Yes, she said. Good. Another beat of silence, and in it she could hear him moving, hear the sounds of a hotel room in motion, the specific sounds of a man who had already made a decision and was implementing it. I'll be there before you wake up. She ended the call, stood in the orchid-heavy air for another minute. Then she straightened her dress, pressed her fingers beneath her eyes where the mascara had tracked, and went back to find something clean in her face to wear back into the ballroom, because whatever came next, she was not going to let them see what they had done to her. But when she re-entered the ballroom through the side corridor, she stopped. The family portrait was in progress. Madame Seo at the center, flanked by her children and their spouses. All of them, even Jisu's husband, who almost never attended these events. The photographer was arranging them with the careful efficiency of someone constructing an image that would be printed, framed, published. Staff and guests stood at a respectful distance, watching. Amani stood at the edge of the crowd. No one called her forward. No one moved to make space. Hyunja turned once, saw her standing at the periphery, and turned back without expression. The camera flashed. Once. Twice. The family smiled. Not warm smiles, but the calibrated smiles of people who understood that this image was a document, a statement, a version of history being written in real time. Amani stood outside the frame and watched her own marriage be photographed without her in it, and something she had been carrying very carefully for 2 years, something she had been treating like fine glass, handling with both hands, refusing to set down even when her arms ached, finally, in that moment, stopped feeling worth the wait. She turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't run. She collected her wrap from the coat check. She thanked the attendant by name because that was who she was. And she stepped outside into the cold night air and called for the estate car and stood on the pavement waiting, with the noise of the city around her and the amber light of the ballroom spilling through the glass behind her, and she felt the particular stillness of a person who has just passed a point they cannot walk back from. She didn't know yet what Kang Woo was going to find when he arrived home ahead of schedule. She didn't know about the security cameras. She didn't know that the very surveillance system installed to protect the estate from external enemies had been recording every corridor, every dining room, every whispered conversation in every hallway for the past 8 months. She didn't know that the man who had built his empire on intelligence and information had access to every frame of footage, every timestamp, every face. She didn't know that by the time she woke up the next morning, Seo Kang-woo would already be standing in his own security room at 3 a.m, watching his family's campaign against his wife play out on 12 monitors simultaneously, his face absolutely still, his hands at his sides, and something cold and total moving through him that his enemies would have recognized immediately and his family had never once thought to fear. She only knew that she was standing on a pavement outside a ballroom that had just photographed her absence, and that something had ended tonight that could not be restarted, and that whatever came next was going to be different from everything that had come before. The estate car arrived. The driver opened the door. Amani Brooks got in. And as the car pulled away from the light and the noise and the glass-faced building where the Kang family was still smiling for cameras that would never capture what they truly were, she looked straight ahead through the windshield at the dark road opening up before her, and she did not look back. Not once. He came home to an empty bedroom and a security room full of evidence. And what Seo Kang-woo watched on those 12 monitors, 8 months of footage, his family's faces, his wife's face, would turn the most feared man in the country into something his enemies had never encountered before, a man with a personal score to settle. Part 3 is coming, and the reckoning begins at home. He arrived at 4:17 in the morning. No announcement, no convoy. One car, one driver, and Seo Kang-woo in the back seat with his jacket folded across his knees and his phone face down on the seat beside him, watching the estate gates open through the windshield with the particular stillness of a man who has spent the entire flight home deciding something. The driver didn't speak. He never did on nights like this. Nights when the quality of the silence coming from the back seat communicated that speech was not wanted and would not be received well. In 12 years of driving for Kang-woo, this man had learned to read the temperature of silence the way a sailor reads weather, and what was coming from the back seat tonight was not the silence of exhaustion or the silence of thought. It was the silence of resolution, the kind that comes after everything else has already been decided. The car stopped at the main entrance. Kang-woo got out before the driver could open the door. He carried nothing. He had left his luggage in Tokyo, told his assistant to deal with it, told his security detail to stay at the hotel, booked the first available flight home on a commercial carrier under a name that was not his own, which was a thing he had not done in 4 years. The last time he had moved like that, anonymously, without infrastructure, without the full weight of the king apparatus around him, had been in a situation with a rival syndicate in Busan that had required the kind of quiet resolution that could not afford witnesses. He walked through the front entrance of his own home and didn't turn on any lights. The estate was dark and quiet at this hour. Staff were asleep in the lower quarters. The family, his mother, his sister, his cousins, were in their respective wings behind their respective doors, sleeping the sleep of people who believed they were safe inside the walls of a house they had helped build and had always treated as their own. Kang-woo moved through the main hall by memory, through the corridor that connected to the East Wing security room, a room behind a door that looked like a wall panel, framed by built-in shelving, accessible only by biometric scan. He pressed his thumb to the panel. The door opened. He stepped inside and pulled it shut behind him. The security room was small and deliberately spare. 12 monitors arranged in 3 rows of 4, a single chair, a keyboard, the blue-white light of screens in standby. He sat down. He entered his credentials. The system came alive around him. He had built this system himself, in the sense that he had specified every camera placement, every retention period, every access restriction. 63 cameras across the estate grounds and interior, hallways, entrances, common rooms, exterior gardens, not bedrooms, not bathrooms, everywhere else. He had installed the system 5 years ago after an incident with a rival family that had taught him, expensively, that the greatest threats to a man's empire rarely come from outside. He had told himself at the time that the system was a professional tool, that it was for the protection of the estate and its occupants and the business operations conducted therein. He had never in 5 years used it to surveil his own family. He pulled up the archive. 8 months, the full retention window. He set the system to flag all footage containing Amani's biometric profile, which the cameras tracked automatically, and let the algorithm run. It took 4 minutes to compile. When it finished, there were 412 flagged clips. 412. He sat in the blue-white light of the security room and he started at the beginning. The first clip was from the previous March, the main dining room. He was in Osaka at the time. He cross-referenced his travel records in a second window to confirm. The footage showed Amani entering the dining room at 7 in the evening, dressed, composed, moving toward her seat at the table. His mother was already seated. Hyun-ja, 2 cousins, the household manager standing near the service door. What happened next took 40 seconds. He watched his mother say something. The cameras had no audio, but the system had a lip-reading overlay he'd had installed for professional security purposes, and he activated it now, watching the translation appear at the bottom of the screen in small white text. The accuracy was 70 to 80% on Korean, less on English, but enough. The translation read, "The table is set for family this evening. You may take your meal in the west sitting room." Amani had stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she had turned and walked back out. He moved to the next clip, and the next. He was in that chair for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He watched his household staff receive redirected instructions on 47 separate occasions, all traceable to his mother's personal assistant. He watched a servant begin to assist Amani in the garden, and then stop, visibly, in response to a gesture from the household manager, who was watching from a window above. He watched Hyun-ja intercept a delivery of documents addressed to Amani, materials for her humanitarian project, and redirect them to a side office where they sat unopened for 11 days. He watched Ji-soo in the upstairs hallway demonstrate for 2 of the younger female cousins how to perform a particular smile while saying something that the lip reader translated as, like this. She can't tell the difference between this and real. He watched the dinner scenes, 14 of them, across 8 months, the progression documented with the clinical clarity of surveillance footage, the escalating exclusions, the public demotions at the table, the redirected servants, the accumulated architecture of it. He watched Amani sit through every one of them with her spine straight and her hands flat on the table and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who has decided that showing pain is the one luxury she cannot afford. He watched his mother at the table perform warmth for the phone camera when Kang-woo called home. He watched the performance switch off the moment the call ended, the warmth draining out of her face like water leaving a basin, replaced with something cooler and more honest, and he watched her turn to Hyunja and say something the lip reader rendered as, "He suspects nothing. Keep the schedule." He found the clip from that evening, the gala, and he didn't need the lip reader for that one because Jisoo and Hyunja were standing outside a glass greenhouse with their faces turned toward the camera he hadn't remembered was positioned at the junction of the East Garden Path, and the angle was good, and the lip reader translation came through at 91% accuracy. He read Jisoo's words on the screen. He's already starting to wonder. Wondering is the first step. We just have to keep feeding the right details to the right people. He read, "She's crying in there, isn't she? Probably. Let her." He read, "Women like that, they hold on. It's the type. They think endurance is the same as love." He sat with those words on the screen in front of him for a long time. The blue-white light, the stillness of 4 in the morning, the sound of his own breathing, which was very controlled and very deliberate, the kind of breathing that is not natural but chosen, because the alternative to chosen breathing right now was something he could not afford. He had built an empire on controlled responses. He had sat across tables from men who had killed people he knew and negotiated with them without allowing his face to communicate anything he didn't want communicated. He had made decisions in the space of seconds that other men would have required days to reach, and he had lived with those decisions without complaint and without revision, because revision was a luxury and second-guessing was a vulnerability, and in the world he operated in, vulnerabilities got people killed. He thought he understood betrayal. He understood now that he had never understood it at its deepest register. He had understood it as a professional phenomenon. Allegiances broken for money or fear or ambition, the clean equations of power shifting. He had not understood it as this, his mother's face performing love for a phone camera and switching it off the moment the call ended. His sister's handwriting on a note delivered with a beige dress. Jisoo's voice, smooth and methodical, describing 8 months of deliberate psychological warfare against the woman he had chosen to build his life with. The woman he stopped that thought. He stopped it with the same mechanism he used to stop everything that threatened to move faster than he could manage. He turned off the monitors. He sat in the dark for 2 minutes exactly. Then he turned them back on, copied the complete archive to an encrypted external drive, removed the drive, put it in his inside jacket pocket, and left the security room. He stood in the hallway outside the hidden door. The estate was still dark, still quiet. He could go upstairs. He could go to the West Wing, where Imani would be sleeping, or not sleeping, because she had known he was coming and she would be lying in that drafty room in the dark, waiting, the way she had been waiting for 2 years for something to change. He went to the West Wing. The door was not fully closed. A line of yellow light along the bottom edge told him she was awake. He knocked once, his knock, the specific rhythm she would recognize, and heard her move before the door opened. She stood in the doorway in the clothes she'd come home in, the emerald gown replaced with a simple sweater and loose trousers, her hair down, her face bare. The mascara was gone. She looked, and this was a word Kang-woo had almost no practice with in the context of how he looked at Imani, because she was not a woman who permitted herself to look this way in front of people. She looked hollowed, not broken. Imani Brooks did not break cleanly. He knew that about her the way he knew fundamental things. But hollowed. Like something had been taken out of her and she was managing the new architecture of herself, testing which walls were still load-bearing. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he crossed the threshold and put his arms around her, and she went very still for a moment. The stillness of a person who has been braced so long that being held is briefly indistinguishable from another kind of pressure. And then something gave, and she pressed her face into his chest, and he stood in the doorway of the West Wing room at 4 in the morning, holding his wife with both arms and feeling the weight of everything she had been carrying alone for 8 months. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Not yet. They stood there for a while in the yellow light of the room, and outside the estate was quiet, and the family slept. And none of them knew that the man they had built their calculations around had come home early and was standing in the room they had assigned his wife to in order to isolate her, holding evidence in his jacket pocket that was going to restructure their world entirely. After a while, Imani pulled back enough to look at him. "How much do you know?" she asked. Her voice was level. She had rebuilt it while he was holding her, he could tell. reconstructed the steadiness she relied on, laid it back into place. "Enough," he said. She studied his face. She had learned his face the way he had learned her voice, by total immersion until she could read it in low light. She read it now and understood from what she found there that enough was not a partial quantity. "The cameras," she said. "Yes." She exhaled slowly, not relief, something more complicated. The exhale of a woman who has spent 2 years hoping to be believed and has now been believed and is discovering that being believed does not immediately make anything easier, that it in fact opens a door to a room full of things that will now have to be reckoned with. "How far back?" she asked. 8 months. A silence. "How much of it did you watch?" "All of it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the estate grounds in the pre-dawn darkness. And when she spoke, her voice had an edge he hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly. Something under anger, the thing that anger is built on top of. "I didn't tell you," she said. "I want you to understand why I didn't tell you." "Imani, no." She turned. "Let me say it. I didn't tell you because I thought if I forced you to choose between me and your family, I would be the reason your family broke apart. I thought if I was patient enough, if I was good enough, if I endured enough, things would find their own level. I thought love was supposed to be worth that." She stopped. "I was wrong about what patience looks like from the outside." "You were not wrong," he said. "I was absent." "You were working." "I was absent," he repeated. The distinction was important to him in a way she heard. "I knew something was wrong. You said it was fine, and I—" He stopped. And for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something cross his face that she'd never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer than either of those. "I chose to believe you because believing you was easier than coming home and finding out what I would have to do about it." The room was very quiet. "That ends now," he said. It was not an apology exactly. With Kang Woo, apology and action were not separate categories. What he had just said was the most direct admission she would ever receive from him, and it came packaged with its own consequence, and she understood that. She also understood that the man standing in front of her had just watched 8 months of footage in a security room in the dark and was now running on something that was operating below the level of strategy. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to handle it." Kang Woo. She crossed to him. She put one hand on his chest, directly over his sternum, the way she always did when she needed him to slow down and arrive in the room, rather than already being 6 steps ahead of it. "I need to know what that means." He looked at her hand on his chest. Then he looked at her face. And something in the machinery behind his eyes shifted, not softened, not exactly, but made room for her in the calculation. "It means," he said, "that this family will answer for what they did to you. Not quietly, not in private, not in a way that allows them to revise what happened later." He reached up and covered her hand with his. "It means they will understand, all of them, everyone connected to this name, what it costs to touch you." She held his gaze. "And your mother?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him sit with it, watched the specific quality of silence that meant he was not avoiding the question but measuring what the true answer was before he spoke it. "My mother," he said finally, "made a choice. She made it in March, and she maintained it for 8 months, and she performed love for me on a phone screen while she was doing it." He paused. "She is still my mother. That does not change. But what she is in this house, what any of them are in this house, in the business, in the family structure, that is going to change completely." Imani nodded slowly. She dropped her hand. "When?" "Soon. I need one thing first." She waited. "I need to know everything you haven't told me," he said. "From the beginning. Every incident, every specific thing that was said, every specific person who said it, every public event, every private moment. I have the footage for what the cameras covered. I need what they didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I'm asking. I know it's going to cost you to say it out loud. I'm asking anyway." She stood in the center of the room for a moment. This was the part she had been protecting him from for 2 years. This was the door she had kept closed out of love. The kind of love that mistook shielding for care. the kind that she now understood had accidentally assisted the people who were trying to take her apart. She went to the chair by the window and sat down. Kang Wu sat on the edge of the bed across from her, elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with the full and absolute attention of a man who has made a decision to listen the way he listens when a situation is about to require everything he has. She started talking. She went back to the beginning, the first week after their wedding, when Madame Seo had received her alone in the receiving room and explained, in quiet and courteous Korean, that there was a way things were done in this family, and there was a way things were not done, and that Imani would find the adjustment easier if she allowed herself to be guided. She talked about the first gala, 18 months ago, where she'd been seated with the business associates rather than the family, and had told herself it was a logistics issue. She talked about the West Wing move, the reason she'd been given versus the reason she'd understood. She talked about Rena's face when she delivered messages. She talked about the names Jisoo had used in company, always deniable, always in a register that forced Imani to choose between confronting them and seeming unhinged or absorbing them and seeming compliant. She talked about the servants, the dinner table, the photographs, the invitation note. She talked for a long time. Kang Wu did not interrupt. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked and his eyes on her face, and he listened to 2 years of his wife's life inside his own house unfold in the pre-dawn dark of the West Wing room, and his expression did not change in the ways that expressions usually change when people are absorbing difficult information. There was no visible shock, no grief, no anger performing itself for her benefit. There was only the quality of a man receiving intelligence and filing it with precision, and beneath that, so far beneath the surface that she almost missed it, something absolutely cold and total and implacable that she recognized as the part of him that had built an empire by understanding one thing above all others: that power, without consequence, is not power. It is invitation. When she finished, it was past 6 in the morning. The sky outside the window was beginning to gray. Kang Wu sat quietly for a moment. Then he stood up, and he was a different configuration of the same man. The same face, the same stillness, but something had organized itself behind it that had not been there when he walked through the front door. "Go to sleep," he said. "Kang Wu, I mean it. Sleep. What happens next is not yours to manage." He moved to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. "You've been managing alone for 2 years. That stops today." She looked at him across the room. The gown was on the chair where she'd folded it. The estate was beginning to stir outside. Distant sounds of the earliest kitchen staff, a vehicle somewhere on the grounds. The family would be awake in 2 or 3 hours. They would come downstairs expecting the normal machinery of the morning to be in place. They had no reason to expect anything else. They did not know he was home. "Don't do anything permanent," she said, "that you'll regret." He looked at her with something that was almost a kind of dark patience. "I never do anything permanent that I'll regret," he said. "The things I regret are always the things I didn't do soon enough." He left. She sat in the chair by the window for a while, listening to his footsteps move away down the corridor. Unhurried, deliberate, a man with full knowledge of exactly where he was going. She had heard that walk before, in professional contexts, in rooms where he was about to do something that people in those rooms were not prepared for. She had never heard it aimed at his own family. She should have slept. She knew that. She lay down on the bed in the gray pre-dawn light and closed her eyes, and her mind was too loud for sleep, running back through 8 months of footage she had never seen but had lived, now rearranged by the knowledge that it had been recorded, that it was documented, that every insult and every redirection and every beige dress and every carefully planned exclusion was sitting on a drive in her husband's jacket pocket like an indictment waiting for a courtroom. She was not present in the East Wing when it happened. She heard about it afterwards, from Rena, who had been in the corridor outside the family breakfast room and whose account was fragmented and delivered in a shaking voice, and from 2 other members of household staff who had been present and who came to her separately, as though they needed to verify with her that what they had witnessed had in fact occurred. Kang Wu had appeared in the family breakfast room at 7:45 in the morning. His mother, his sister, and Jisoo had been at the table. The 2 older male cousins had not yet come down. The household manager had been standing near the service door. He had walked in without announcement and stood at the head of the table and looked at them, and the room had gone very quiet very fast, because the people in it understood immediately, in the way that people who have survived proximity to dangerous men understand things, that something was wrong. Madame Seo had recovered first, She was a woman who had been performing composure in difficult situations for 60 years, and she performed it now, setting down her teacup, straightening her posture, looking at her son with an expression of measured welcome. "Kang Wu," she said, "we didn't know you were home." "I know," he said. She waited for more. There was no more. Just those two words, flat and factual, and the quality of his silence after them, which had a texture that was new even to her, and she had known this man since she had made him. Hyunja said, "When did you arrive?" "Early this morning." Jisoo had not spoken. She was watching him with the particular alertness of a person whose instincts are better calibrated than their confidence, and her instincts were telling her something her face was working to conceal. "You should have told us," Madame Seo said. "We would have prepared." "I watched the security footage," he said. The breakfast room went so quiet that Rena, in the corridor, reported that she could hear the fountain in the east garden from where she was standing. Madame Seo's face did not change immediately. That was the thing Rena reported with a kind of awe, that for 3 or 4 full seconds, Madame Seo's face simply did not change, as though she was running through possibilities, calculating vectors, finding the response that would be most effective. Then she said, carefully, "I don't know what you think you saw." Kang Wu reached into his jacket pocket and placed the encrypted drive on the breakfast table, between the teapot and the fruit bowl, where everyone at the table could see it. 8 months, he said. 412 clips. Jisoo made a sound. It was very small, involuntary. The sound of a person whose floor has just disappeared. Kang Wu! Hyunja's voice had found a register that was almost placating. Almost, but not quite, because there was no clean version of placating available here, and she knew it. "There are things about managing this family that you have never had to—" "Be quiet," he said. She stopped. He looked at his mother. "I have the footage. I have Imani's account. I have 8 months of documented evidence of a deliberate, coordinated campaign to psychologically destroy my wife while I was away from this house." He paused. "I want you to tell me I'm wrong. I'm giving you this one opportunity to tell me something that changes what I understand to be true." Madame Seo looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something Rena had not expected and would describe for weeks afterward with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. She sat back in her chair, and she folded her hands on the table, and she said without apology, without revision, with the absolute steadiness of a woman who has been a matriarch too long to perform contrition convincingly, "I did what I believed was necessary to protect this family's future." The words landed in the silence like a stone into still water. "She is not one of us," Madame Seo continued, her voice perfectly controlled. "She will never be one of us. And you, my son, are too sentimental to see what this marriage cost this family in the long term. Everything I did because someone in this family had to be willing to—" "You are removed from the family council," Kang Wu said. She stopped. "Effective immediately. Every formal role, every advisory position, every business involvement connected to the Kang name. Removed." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then, "Jisoo, every business holding, every title, every financial privilege connected to the Kang family structure. Removed. You will be escorted from Kang-controlled territories by the end of the week." Jisoo's face had gone the color of the white tablecloth. "Kang Wu," Hyunja said, and her voice had broken through the veneer of composure into something more unguarded, something almost desperate. "You can't dismantle this family over a—" She stopped herself. Too late. The word she had not said was nevertheless in the room with all of them, taking up space, and Kang Wu looked at his sister with an expression that Rena would later describe, searching for language, as the look of a man who has just watched a door close that he had been hoping would stay open. "Over a what?" he said. Hyunja didn't answer. "Over a woman you've spent 2 years trying to convince me isn't worth defending," he said. "Over my wife. Over the person I chose." He picked up the drive from the table. "Every leadership position you hold in the family's corporations. Gone. I'll have my legal team execute the documentation today." He looked at the 3 of them, his mother, his sister, his cousin, seated at the breakfast table of the house he owned, in the family he had inherited and expanded and protected, and he let them look back at him long enough to understand that this was not a negotiation, not the opening position of a conversation that would find its way to compromise, not the anger of a man who would cool. "This house," he said, "belongs to my wife and to me. What happens inside it is going to reflect that. From today." He left the breakfast room. Rena heard his footsteps in the corridor, moving back toward the west wing, and she pressed herself against the wall to give him space. And as he passed, she caught one glimpse of his face in profile. Jaw set, eyes forward, the face of a man who has just done something irrevocable and is already 3 steps past it into what comes next. What came next, Amani did not yet know. She was still in the West Wing room when Kang Wu came back. She had not slept. She was sitting in the chair by the window, watching the estate grounds come into the full light of morning, when the door opened and he came in and crossed directly to her and crouched down in front of the chair so they were at eye level and took both her hands in his. She looked at his face. She read it. And what she found there was not the controlled blankness of a man who had just executed a professional decision. It was something more exposed than that. The face of a man arriving at the far side of something that has cost him, finally allowing himself to show that it has cost him, because he was in the one room in this estate where he trusted the person looking at him to see it without using it against him. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Your mother will live with the consequences of what she chose," he said. "That's what consequences are." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the east wing, she could hear the distant sound of a door being opened and then closed with force. One of them, unable to contain the shock of it, expressing through the only mechanism still available to her what she could not afford to say out loud. "This isn't over," Amani said. "Not a question." "No," he said. "There's more." She waited. The gala, the footage, the specific evidence of what Jisoo planned, the narrative they were building, the people they were feeding information to. His hands were still holding hers. It can't be handled privately. A private resolution can be revised. It can be denied. In 6 months, in a year, the story becomes something else. We become the villain, you become the destabilizing influence, and they become the family that suffered. He looked at her carefully. "What I'm planning requires a public forum. It requires witnesses who cannot be managed afterward, and it requires you to be present for it." She understood what he was saying. She understood the specific geometry of it, the way his world operated, the way power was maintained not through private agreements, but through public demonstrations that established unambiguously where the lines were and what happened when they were crossed. "When?" she said. 3 days, he said. "I'm calling a full assembly. Every captain, every executive, every family member, every significant ally. An emergency leadership meeting." He paused. "They won't know what it's actually for until they're in the room." She looked at his face. She thought about standing in that ballroom 3 hours ago, the family portrait, the frame she had been left out of, the ambassador's wife who had watched it happen with carefully averted eyes. She thought about Jisoo's voice in the greenhouse. Let her. She was never going to be in it. She thought about 2 years of chosen silence and what it had cost her, and what it had almost cost her marriage, and what it had allowed to grow in the space that silence had left. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded once. He stood. He was moving again, already in motion toward the next thing, the thing after that, the full machinery of Seo Kang-woo in motion with a target and a timeline, and the cold and total intention of a man who had finally understood where his real war was being fought. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. "Imani, ne?" he said. "The West Wing." She looked at him. "You're moving back to the main bedroom today," he said. "I'll have your things transferred this morning." It was not a large thing in the scale of what was coming. It was not the confrontation or the assembly or the reckoning that was 3 days away. It was simply a room, a door, a location in a house. But she felt it go through her like something solid being placed back in a space that had been empty for too long, and she understood that some repairs begin not with grand gestures but with exactly this: a man standing in a doorway telling his wife where she belongs. "Okay," she said. He left. And Amani Brooks sat in the chair by the window of the West Wing for the last time, watching the morning settle over the estate grounds, while 3 days away, in a room full of the most powerful people connected to the Kong name, a reckoning was being assembled that would change the shape of this family permanently. The family that had spent 2 years trying to make her invisible was about to discover what it looked like when Seo Kang-woo made something undeniable. 3 days. A room full of witnesses who don't know why they've been summoned. 12 monitors loaded with 8 months of evidence. And one woman who has endured everything, seated finally where she belongs, at her husband's side. Part 4 is the moment this family faces the full weight of what they built. Don't look away. The 3 days were the quietest the estate had ever been. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of pressure. The kind that builds in the space between a decision and its execution. The kind that makes the air feel thicker than it should be and causes people to speak in lower voices without understanding why. The family felt it. The staff felt it. Even the groundskeepers, who had no knowledge of what was coming, moved through the estate grounds with the subdued efficiency of people who had read the weather correctly and were making their preparations accordingly. Madame Seo did not leave her wing on the first day. On the second day, she emerged twice, once to speak with her personal attorney, who arrived at the estate in a dark sedan and left 40 minutes later with the careful expression of a man who had just been told something he needed time to process, and once to stand in the East Garden for 11 minutes, in the cold morning air, alone, her coat pulled around her, looking at nothing in particular with the fixed gaze of a woman conducting an internal inventory of her resources. She did not attempt to speak to Kang-woo. She did not attempt to speak to Amani. Hyunja spent the 3 days on her phone, cycling through calls that she took in her bedroom with the door closed. Kang-woo's legal team had already begun executing the documentation. She had received the first set of papers on the morning of the second day, delivered by a courier who had the grace to be expressionless. She had signed for them with a steady hand and then sat for 2 hours in the armchair by her window, the envelope unopened in her lap, before she finally tore it apart and read what was being taken from her. Jisoo left the estate on the first night. No announcement. A car was called at 11 in the evening, luggage was loaded, and by midnight she was gone. Not to her own apartment in the city, which fell within Kang-controlled territory, but to a hotel in a district that she apparently believed was sufficiently removed from the Kang network to provide cover. She was wrong about that, but the information was filed and not acted upon, because Kang-woo had uses for it that required patience. Amani slept in the main bedroom. The first night she lay awake for a long time in the dark, aware of the space around her, the width of the room, the correct warmth of the heating, the absence of the drafts that had been a constant feature of the West Wing. Kang-woo slept beside her, or occupied the space beside her in a configuration that resembled sleep, but was probably something closer to the suspended state he entered when his mind was running at full capacity on a problem that required morning to act on. She could feel it. The particular stillness of a man who is not resting, but processing, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders that told her he was 10 steps ahead of the room and reviewing each of them for structural weaknesses. At some point past 2, she turned toward him in the dark and said quietly, "You don't have to do this in a way that destroys them completely." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that." "I mean it," she said. "I want justice. I don't want obliteration." Another beat of silence. "Those two things are going to look very similar from where my family is standing." "Maybe," she said, "but I need to know the difference is real. For me." He turned his head toward her in the dark. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she knew the quality of his attention when it was fully on her. It had a specific weight to it, like a hand between the shoulder blades, steadying. "The difference is real," he said. She believed him. Not because she was naive about what he was capable of. She had never been naive about that. It was part of the deal she had made with herself the day she'd agreed to marry him, the calculation she'd run with her eyes open. She believed him because she knew, with the bone-level certainty that 2 years of close observation provides, that Seo Kang-woo operated by a code that was not the law, but was in its own way inflexible. He did not destroy things for the pleasure of destruction. He destroyed things because they were threats, or because they had demonstrated that they would become threats if left intact. His family had crossed a line that made them fall into that category, but she was in his ear, and she intended to stay there. The invitations went out on the second day. They were not framed as invitations. They were summonses, delivered through the appropriate channels with the appropriate authority behind them, describing an emergency leadership meeting of the Kang family and its associated network, mandatory attendance, no exceptions. The phrasing was precise and offered no details. In the world Kang-woo operated in, that phrasing was sufficient. Men who received summonses from Seo Kangwoo attended them. By the morning of the third day, 63 confirmations had been received. Kangwoo spent that morning in his private office with his two most trusted lieutenants and his legal team, and the door was closed, and Amani did not ask what was discussed. She spent the morning in her own office working on the Hanoi proposal, because the work did not stop because her life was in upheaval. It never had. It was one of the things she had always done to maintain the proof that she existed beyond the context other people tried to confine her to. At noon, she called Deanna in Chicago. Deanna picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," she said immediately, because Deanna had known Amani for 11 years and could read the specific texture of a phone call from across an ocean. "I'm okay," Amani said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." A pause. "Things are happening. Good things, I think. Necessary things. But I don't know yet what the other side of them looks like." "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Is he?" "He's handling it," Amani said. "He came home." A silence on Deanna's end that carried 11 years of friendship in it. The specific silence of a woman who has watched her best friend love a complicated man and has always reserved full judgment until she had full information. "Okay," Deanna said finally. "Call me after." "I will." "Amani." Her voice shifted down a register. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anybody, right? Not to his family, not to his world, not to anyone in that house." Amani sat with that for a moment. Outside her office window, the estate grounds were bare and bright in the winter light. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm staying." She ended the call and went back to the proposal and worked until 3 in the afternoon, and then she went to her closet and stood in front of it for a long time. What she chose was simple: a black dress. Structured, long-sleeved, no adornment, the kind of garment that says nothing and therefore says everything. She dressed without asking anyone's opinion, fixed her hair the way she wore it when she was certain of herself, put in the single pair of gold earrings her mother had given her at 22, and looked at her reflection in the mirror for exactly 1 second before she turned away. She was ready before Kangwoo came to find her. He appeared in the doorway of the bedroom at 5:30, already dressed. Dark suit, no tie. The particular configuration of himself that he wore when formality was required, but he needed to remind the room that he was not a man who required formal structures to hold his authority. He looked at her. He took in the dress, the earrings, the way she was standing. "Good," he said. Not a compliment exactly, a recognition. "What time?" she said. 7. "They'll start arriving at 6:30. He crossed to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and removed the encrypted drive. Held it for a moment in his palm, such a small object for the weight of what it contained. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. "The AV team finished the setup an hour ago." She looked at him. "How many screens?" 4. "In the main assembly hall." He looked back at her. "The footage runs approximately 90 minutes in its compiled form. I'll stop it when it's sufficient. I don't intend to make it a performance." "Make sure it's enough," she said. "Not more." "Enough," he agreed. They stood in the bedroom for a moment, the two of them, the drive in his pocket, the evening ahead. Then Imani crossed to him and straightened his jacket lapel, not because it needed straightening, but because it was a thing she did, a small physical act that said, "I'm with you," and he put one hand briefly over hers, and then they left the room together. The assembly hall was the largest interior space in the estate, a room that existed for exactly this kind of gathering, designed with the proportions of a place where significant things happened, and the people inside it were meant to feel the significance. Long table down the center, seating for 40, additional seating along the walls. The 4 screens had been installed at the far end, 2 floor-to-ceiling panels flanking the central position, 2 auxiliary screens on the side walls. The AV team had done clean work. The room looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A boardroom, not a theater, except for the screens. Guests began arriving at 6:30. Imani stood with Kangwoo in the anteroom adjacent to the hall, watching them come through. Captains and executives and lawyers and allied family heads, men and women who represented the full breadth of what the Kang name controlled. Most of them she recognized. Most of them greeted her with the cautious warmth they had always deployed. Not cold, not warm, but calibrated, positioned somewhere in the middle zone where no strong opinion was formed or committed to. Tonight, They were attentive in a different way. Word had not spread about the contents of the meeting, but word had spread that something had happened. It always did. In networks built on information, the tremors reach the edges before the center has even fully settled. She saw it in the way they looked at her, a fraction more directly than usual, a fraction more carefully, the look of people trying to read a situation from limited data. She met their eyes and held them and said nothing that could be read. At 7:10, Kang Woo walked into the assembly hall. Amani walked beside him. Not behind, not flanking. Beside. Level, shoulder proximity. The position of a partner rather than an attachment. The room settled into quiet with the particular efficiency of a room full of professionals who understand that when Seo Kang-woo walks in, you stop what you're doing. The family was there too. Madame Seo had come. Amani had not been certain she would, had wondered if she would claim illness or absence, but she was there, seated near the head of the table, her posture impeccable, her face composed with a control that was in its own way impressive. Hyun-ja beside her. The two older male cousins 3 seats down. Jisoo was not present, which meant she either hadn't been found or had correctly estimated what was coming and calculated that the consequences of absence were preferable to the consequences of presence. She had miscalculated. Kang-woo walked to the head of the table. He did not sit. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the room. 61 people, the extended capacity of what his name had built. And he let the silence run for 5 full seconds before he spoke. "I called this meeting under emergency protocols," he said. His voice was level and carried clearly to every corner of the room without being raised. "There is no business emergency. The emergency is personal, and it affects this family and everyone connected to it." The room was very still. "I'm going to show you something," he said. "After that, I'll speak. I ask that no one leave this room before I've finished." He nodded once to the AV technician at the rear of the hall. The 4 screens came alive simultaneously. The footage began with timestamp and location data, visible in the upper corner of each screen. The estate security system's formatting, clinical and irrefutable. The first clip, the main dining room, March 14th, Amani in the doorway. Madame Seo at the table. The lip reader translation running at the bottom of each screen in both Korean and English. "The table is set for family this evening. You may take your meal in the west sitting room." The room absorbed this in silence. Amani stood at Kang-woo's left, slightly behind his shoulder, and she watched the screens with the rest of them. Watched her own face in the footage, the pause in the doorway, the turn and the exit, and felt the strange dissociation of observing something that happened to her body from the outside, the evidence of a moment she remembered in her skin being rendered into documentation. The clips moved. The system had been compiled with precision. Not everything, not the full 412, but the architecture of it, the sequence that established pattern and intention, the dining room redirections, the servant instructions, the document interception, Jisoo's demonstration in the upstairs hallway. Like this. She can't tell the difference between this and real. Rendered in close-up on 4 screens simultaneously, the lip reader translation sharp and clear. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound. Not a word, just the involuntary sound a person makes when something lands hard enough to require a physical response. Then the gala footage. Madame Seo in the center of the ballroom, the room's acoustics working in the camera's favor. The translation across 4 screens. Some people can wear expensive dresses, but they will never become family. And then the greenhouse exterior, Jisoo and Hyun-ja on the garden path. The 91% accuracy lip reader running their conversation across 4 screens while 61 people read every word. He's already starting to wonder. Wondering is the first step. Women like that, they hold on. It's the type. She's crying in there, isn't she? Probably. Let her. She was never going to be in it. Kang-woo let the footage run through 3 more clips. A dinner scene from August, a hallway incident in September, the beige dress being laid on the bed in October with the card attached, and then he raised his hand and the screens went dark. The room was so quiet, Amani could hear her own heartbeat. He let it sit for 10 seconds. 12. The silence of a room full of powerful people who have just seen something they did not expect to see and are not yet certain what it means for them, their allegiances, their positions, their assessment of where safety lies. Then he straightened up from the table and he spoke. My wife has lived in this house for 2 years, he said. In those 2 years, members of this family conducted a coordinated and deliberate campaign against her. Not impulsive cruelty, not poor judgment, but organized, planned, long-term psychological warfare designed to destroy her standing in this house and in my eyes. A pause. The people responsible are in this room. Madame So was looking at her hands on the table. Her face had not changed, but her hands, Amani noticed this, noticed it with the attention she had trained on this woman for 2 years. Her hands were not still. The left one had moved slightly inward, pressing against the table's edge in a way that was barely perceptible, but was, for Madame Seo, the equivalent of trembling. I want to be direct about what this means, Kang Wu said, because this room contains people who deserve clarity rather than ambiguity. He looked along the table, the captains, the executives, the lawyers, the allied family heads, all of them watching him with the fixed attention of people who have staked their professional lives on reading him correctly. This is not a family dispute that will be managed privately and then set aside. This is a public accounting. What happened to my wife is a matter of record in this room, witnessed by everyone present, and the consequences are proportionate to that. He reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the encrypted drive on the table in front of him. Complete archive, he said. 8 months. Copies are held by my legal team, my security director, and one additional party I won't name. He looked at his mother. There is no version of events in which this footage ceases to exist. I want that to be understood by everyone. Madame Seo lifted her eyes from the table. She looked at her son across the length of the assembly hall, and what passed between them in that look was something that had nothing to do with the room, or the witnesses, or the screens. It was older than all of it. It was the look of a woman who had made a son and believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who has never been seriously wrong about the things that mattered most, that she understood him completely, and was now, for the first time in 60 years, genuinely uncertain. She said, "Everything I did was for this family." Her voice was steady. She intended it as a declaration, and it arrived as one. But the room's silence around it was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of witnesses who have already seen the evidence and are now watching the accused speak. "You did it to my wife," Kang Wu said, "while I was away, while she had no protection from the people who were supposed to be her family." His voice did not rise. It was still level, still precise, and it was more devastating for that. "You did it, and you performed something different for me on a phone screen, and you told your people to keep the schedule." He let that land. "I know what you told them. I read your lips on the footage." Madame Seo's left hand pressed harder against the table edge. "You are removed from the family council," he said. "All formal roles, effective immediately. The papers are already executed." He shifted his eyes to Hyun Ja. "Your leadership positions across the family's corporations and foundations removed. Documentation is being processed today. You'll receive confirmation by tomorrow morning." Hyunja's face had gone rigid, not with anger, with the particular rigidity of a person who is holding themselves together by will alone and knows that what they're holding is not going to hold much longer. "Kang Wu," she said. Her voice came out thinner than she'd intended. "These are positions I have held for 15 years, positions I built. Positions you held while organizing the deliberate humiliation of my wife," he said. "Every week, every trip I took, every phone call where you were in the background being part of a family that welcomed her." His jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure, and it was controlled so quickly that half the room probably missed it. 15 years doesn't change 8 months. Hyunja said nothing more. He looked at the room. "Jisoo Park," he said, "not present tonight. That is noted, and it does not protect her. Every Kang business holding, every title, every financial privilege, stripped. She has until the end of the week to vacate properties within Kang-controlled territory. My security team has her current location." A captain near the middle of the table, a compact, gray-haired man named Director Yoon, who had been with the Kong operation for 22 years, and whom Imani had always found watchful in a way that suggested deep processing rather than absence, shifted slightly in his chair and said, without inflection, "And the broader network? What is the standing directive regarding Mrs. Seo?" It was the question the room had been waiting for, the question that established where the lines were drawn for everyone connected to the Kong name. Not just the family, but every captain, every executive, every allied party in the room. Kang Woo looked at Director Yoon. Mrs. Seo, he said, is the head of this household. She has the authority and the standing that comes with that position. Any person connected to this network who treats her otherwise answers to me directly. He let a beat pass. That directive has always been in effect. As of tonight, it is stated explicitly and on record in this room. Then he turned to Amani. He turned to her in front of 61 witnesses, in front of his mother, his sister, his captains, and executives, and the full assembled weight of what his name represented. And he crossed the 3 feet between them, and he took her hand, and he walked her to the chair at the head of the table. His chair. The chair that had always designated the highest authority in any Kang gathering. He pulled it out. He waited. She sat down. He remained standing beside her, his hand resting on the back of the chair. Not over her. Beside her. The distinction was precise and deliberate, and every professional in the room understood it. This is my wife, he said. This is where she sits. The room was absolutely still. Madame Seo was looking at the chair, at Imani in the chair. And the expression on her face was not rage. It was something more complicated, something that moved through several phases in the space of 3 seconds before settling into a stillness that Imani recognized from 2 years of watching this woman, as the stillness she deployed when she had no remaining moves and knew it. Then something happened that no one in the room had prepared for. Director Yoon, 22 years of service, gray-haired and watchful, reached forward and picked up his water glass. He looked at Imani at the head of the table. He inclined his head, a slight, precise, deliberate motion that in this context and this room carried the full weight of what it was. He said simply, Mrs. Seo, to her. The correct name, the correct title, in front of everyone. 3 seconds later, the executive to his left did the same, then the attorney at the far end. Then, in a cascade that moved down the table with the irreversibility of something structural giving way, the room acknowledged her, one by one, some with words, some with the inclined head, some simply by meeting her eyes and holding them without flinching, until the acknowledgement had reached every person at that table who chose to give it. Not everyone did. The 2 older male cousins did not. Hyun-ja stared at the table's surface. Madame Seo sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes somewhere past the middle distance. But the room had spoken. The weight of it had shifted. Imani sat at the head of the table and did not perform anything. She did not smile with the gracious warmth she had deployed for 2 years to demonstrate she was not a threat. She did not project authority she hadn't yet established. She sat with her back straight and her hands on the table, and she looked at the room, at the people who had just decided what they believed, at the family who had spent 2 years deciding she didn't belong. And she let them look back at her, and she was exactly who she was, and she did not ask anyone's permission for it. Kang Woo spoke for another 12 minutes. He addressed logistics, the restructuring of the family council, interim leadership appointments for the positions being vacated, the legal framework for the changes being executed. He was precise and comprehensive and gave the room the information it needed to understand the new configuration of things. His voice remained level throughout. When he finished, he asked if there were questions. There were 3. Logistical, professional, offered with the careful neutrality of people adjusting their working understanding of the hierarchy. He answered each one and then closed the meeting. People began to leave. Some of them stopped to speak with Kang Woo at the head of the table. Director Yoon, 2 of the senior executives, the family attorney, professional acknowledgments, repositionings, the quiet recalibrations of people who have witnessed a shift in power and are establishing their position relative to it. No one approached Madame Seo. She rose from her chair when the room had thinned enough to allow it without the motion being conspicuous, and she walked toward the exit with her spine perfectly straight and her head level and her face composed with the absolute control of a 60-year-old woman who had built herself into something formidable and was not going to let it crack in a room full of witnesses. At the door she paused. She looked back, once, at her son. Kang Woo was looking at her. What passed between them lasted approximately 4 seconds, and contained everything that had ever been built between a mother and the son she had shaped, and everything that had been broken in the past 3 days, and everything that would be different from here and would not be restored. 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked through the door and was gone. Hyunja left without looking at anyone. The room continued to empty. By 8:30, only Kang-woo, Imani, and 2 members of his security team remained, along with the AV technician breaking down the equipment at the far end of the hall. Imani stood up from the chair. Her legs were steadier than she'd expected. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her because somewhere in the past 2 hours, she had been running on something that was not quite adrenaline and not quite calm, but something in between. The state a person reaches when they have passed through the worst of something and arrived at a place that is not yet peace but is unquestionably different from where they were. Kang-woo came to stand beside her. He looked at the table, the drive still sitting in front of where he'd been standing, the 4 dark screens at the far end, the ordered aftermath of what had just occurred. "It's done," she said. "The public part," he said. She looked at him. "What's left?" He was quiet for a moment. "Jisoo." He picked up the drive and put it back in his pocket. She planned the operational specifics. The narrative campaign, the people she was feeding information to, the specific goal of making me doubt you. That requires a separate resolution. What kind of resolution? The kind that involves the people she talked to being given accurate information. The story she built needs to be unmade with the same precision she used to build it. He looked at Imani. "That's going to take longer than tonight. But it will happen. It will happen." She nodded. She moved to the door of the assembly hall and stopped with her hand on the frame, looking back at the room, the long table, the empty chairs, the small rectangle of the encrypted drive sitting in the center of the table that Kang-woo had momentarily left behind. The evidence of 2 years, documented and deployed and witnessed by 61 people who would carry what they'd seen back out into the world. "Your mother," she said, without turning around. "I'll speak with her," he said. "Not tonight, when she's ready to have a different kind of conversation than the one that's been happening." "Can she come back?" He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. His face was doing something she had only seen it do a handful of times, working through something that resisted the precision he usually brought to bear, something that didn't reduce to strategy or calculation. He looked, for a moment, like what he was under everything else. A man who loved his mother and had found her on 12 security monitors committing the most specific kind of betrayal, the kind that is patient and planned and performed with a smile, the kind that knows exactly where to cut. "That depends on her," he said. "Not on me. Not on you. On what she decides to be from here." Imani held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "That's fair." She pushed through the door into the corridor. The estate was quiet around them, the staff withdrawn, the family in their respective silences, the enormous house containing the aftermath of what had just been unmade and what was being, slowly, rebuilt. At the end of the corridor, a servant who had worked in the estate for 11 years, a woman named Cha Song-yi, who had been present for 8 months of footage and had, on more than one occasion, absorbed an order to redirect away from Imani with visible discomfort and silent compliance, was standing near the wall with a tray, having clearly expected the meeting to have concluded and having been waiting for instruction. She looked at Imani. Her face was carefully neutral, with something working underneath it. Imani said, "Song-yi, thank you for staying late tonight." Song-yi looked at her. Something crossed her face. Something that had been compressed for a long time. She bowed her head, properly, genuinely, not the perfunctory gesture of hierarchy, but something with actual weight behind it. "Mrs. Seo," she said. Kang-woo watched this from behind Imani's shoulder. He said nothing. He let it happen, which was its own kind of statement. They walked together toward the main staircase. The house was quiet around them, the particular quiet of an aftermath, which is different from all other kinds of quiet, because it is full of things that have just been said rather than things waiting to be said. At the foot of the stairs, Imani stopped. Kang-woo. I want the greenhouse," she said, "for my project. I want to convert the space, so install proper work tables, proper climate control, a dedicated meeting area for the women from the Hanoi program when they visit." She paused. "I want to change what that room is." He looked at her. The specific look he gave her sometimes, the one she'd first seen across a charity function table in Chicago, the look of a man who had encountered something that interested him at a level beyond the ordinary. "Done," he said. She nodded once. She started up the stairs. Behind her, the estate that had spent 2 years treating her like a guest in her own home was quiet and still and reorganized around a new truth that 61 witnesses would carry out of it and into the world. That Amani Brooks was Mrs. CO. She sat at the head of the table, and the man who had built this empire had made it unambiguously, irrevocably, and publicly clear what it cost to forget that. But at the top of the stairs, in the hallway outside the main bedroom, she stopped again. Because there was a sound coming from behind the closed door of Madame Seo's wing. Not loud, barely audible. The kind of sound that leaks through walls not because it is projected, but because it cannot be contained. A woman crying. Amani stood in the hallway and listened to it for a moment. She thought about a greenhouse full of white orchids. She thought about herself standing in a room exactly like that one, making exactly that sound, while two women stood outside and said, "Let her." She thought about what it would cost to be the kind of woman who heard this sound and kept walking. She stood there for a long time. What Imani does next, in that hallway, outside that door, is the moment that decides not just what this marriage is, but what kind of woman she has chosen to be. And it will change everything that comes after. Part 5 is where justice meets grace, and where every wound finally gets its answer. She stood in that hallway for 3 minutes. She counted them without meaning to. The way you count things when you are trying to give yourself time to arrive at a decision that you already know you've made, but haven't yet accepted the cost of. The sound from behind the door was not loud. It was not performative. It had the specific, exhausted quality of crying that has been happening for a long time in private and has simply exceeded the capacity of the walls to contain it. The sound of a woman in her 70s who has spent 60 years being formidable and is, in this moment, alone with the consequences of what formidability cost her. Amani knew that sound. She knew it from the inside. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. 2 knocks. Not soft. Not tentative. Not the knock of a woman asking permission. 2 knocks that said, "I am here, and I know you're there, and I am choosing this." Silence from the other side. The sound stopped. The particular quality of silence that follows crying, the held breath, the self-reconstruction, the gathering of whatever composure remains. Then, "Who is it?" Madame Seo's voice. Flattened, stripped of its usual architecture, but controlled, even now controlled. "It's Amani," she said. A longer silence. The door opened. Madame Seo stood in the doorway of her suite in a dark silk robe, her hair down for the first time Amani had ever seen it. Silver white, fine, falling to her shoulders. And without the structure of her daytime presentation, she looked smaller than Amani had ever perceived her. Not diminished, smaller, which is different. The way a building looks different when you see its actual dimensions without the scaffolding. Her eyes were not red. Madame Seo was not a woman whose eyes went red, but there was something around them, a looseness in the surrounding tissue, a slight swelling at the inner corners, that told the story without announcing it. She looked at Amani. Her expression moved through several configurations in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise first, then a flicker of something defensive, then something that was almost contempt but didn't quite reach it, as though contempt was the familiar instrument, and she had reached for it automatically but found she couldn't play it right now. Then she said nothing and stepped back from the door. Amani walked in. Madame Seo's suite was the largest in the estate, furnished with the specific restraint of someone who has never needed ostentation to establish authority. Antique writing desk by the window. 2 chairs flanking a low table near the east wall. Photographs on the surface of the dresser. Amani had never been in this room before, and she looked at the photographs without moving toward them, simply registering their existence. Kang Woo as a child. Hyun Ja as a teenager. A man she didn't recognize, older, with Kang Woo's bone structure, who must have been the late patriarch, the man Madame Seo had built this empire alongside before he died 11 years ago, and she had held it together by force of will and the particular ferocity of a woman who refuses to let something outlive the man it was built for. Amani understood something, standing in that room, that she had not fully understood before. It didn't change what had been done, but it added dimension to it, the way that seeing the full picture of a person adds dimension without excusing what they've chosen. Madame Seo moved to one of the chairs by the low table and sat. She did not invite Amani to sit. She did not tell her to leave. She sat with her hands in her lap and waited. with the patience of a woman who had learned that waiting was one of the few dignities that couldn't be taken from you. Amani sat in the other chair. They were 4 feet apart. The distance between them had the density of everything that had been said and done and documented and witnessed in the past several hours, in the past 2 years. "I'm not here to extend an olive branch," Amani said. She said it clearly, without heat. "I want to be honest with you about that." Madame Seo looked at her hands. "What you did to me was not a misunderstanding," Amani continued. "It was not cultural friction or a failure to communicate. You planned it. You maintained it for 8 months. You performed something different for your son while you were doing it." She paused. "I watched the footage tonight along with everyone else in that room. I saw my own face in it. I know exactly what was done and how." Madame Seo said nothing. "I'm here," Amani said, "because I heard you crying, and because I am not the kind of woman who walks past a sound like that and feels nothing." She stopped. "Let that sit. I don't know yet what I am to you. I don't know if we ever become something that deserves a name. But I know what I am to myself, and I know that walking past that door was going to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose." Madame Seo's hands shifted slightly in her lap, one pressing against the other. Then she said, without looking up, "You should have walked past." "Maybe," Amani said. A silence. "Why didn't you?" It was not quite a question. The inflection was flat. The inflection of a woman asking something she has already concluded she won't understand the answer to. "Because being cruel to someone who is cruel to you is the easiest thing in the world," Amani said. "And I stopped letting easy things make my decisions a long time ago." Madame Seo looked up then. She looked at Amani directly, and what was in her eyes in that moment was not the calibrated assessment she usually deployed, the measuring instrument, the cold appraisal. It was something more unguarded than that. Something that had been operating below the surface of 60 years of performance and was now, in a stripped room at 8:30 in the evening with nowhere left to go, visible. It looked, Amani thought, almost like grief. "I have run this family since my husband died," Madame Seo said. Her voice had a different register now, lower, without the architecture of authority behind it. Raw in the way that things are raw when the insulation has been removed. 11 years. I kept every piece of what he built together, every alliance, every business, every relationship. I did it alone, and I did not fail." She paused. My son is the man he is because of what I maintained for 11 years while he built what he built. And then he brought home—" She stopped. "Say it," Amani said. Madame Seo looked at her. "A woman I did not choose, from a world I did not understand." And he looked at her the way he has never once in his life looked at anything I tried to give him. Something crossed her face, something that was painful to watch because it was so unguarded, and Madame Seo being unguarded was a thing Amani had never imagined being in the same room with. And I thought, if I waited long enough, if I made it difficult enough, if I demonstrated clearly enough what the cost was, he would choose the family over me, Amani said. Madame Seo was quiet. "That's what you believed," Amani said. "That if you made my life here impossible, eventually the weight of it would make me leave or make me someone he couldn't defend, and then the choice would make itself." "Yes," Madame Seo said. The word was quiet and precise, and cost her something visible. Amani sat with that for a moment, the honesty of it. She had known it, had understood it at the level of instinct, but hearing it stated directly, in a room with no audience, by a woman who had nothing left to perform, was different from knowing it. It had weight. It had the specific weight of a thing that has been carried by one person for 2 years and has now been acknowledged by the person who put it there. "Did you think," Amani said carefully, "that he would choose you? That when it came down to it, he would choose the family over the woman he loves?" Madame Seo looked at the window. Outside, the estate grounds were dark. "I thought," she said slowly, "that I knew my son." "You do know him," Amani said. "That's what you miscalculated. You knew him well enough to know he was capable of absolute loyalty, and you underestimated who he'd decided to be absolutely loyal to." A long silence. "He is not going to forgive this easily," Madame Seo said. "Kangwoo does not—" "I know how he forgives," Imani said. "I know what it takes and what it looks like and how long it costs. You don't have to explain your son to me." She said it without sharpness, just the fact of it. But I think you know that he is not finished with you. I think you know that what he did tonight was not the end. It was the line that tells you what happens if the behavior continues. She paused. It's not a closed door, it's a boundary. He's not good at those with people he loves. He should have drawn this one 2 years ago. Tonight he did. Madame So was looking at her. The expression had shifted again. The grief still there, but something added to it now, something more complicated. The expression of a woman reassessing, not with pleasure, but with the specific discomfort of encountering something she had categorically dismissed and is now forced to re-examine. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because someone should, Imani said. And because you are his mother. Whatever you've done to me, you are still his mother, and that is not nothing. It will never be nothing to him. And I would rather he have a mother who understands what happened than a mother who lives the rest of her life in a version of events that lets her believe she was simply misunderstood. Madame Seo sat with that for a long time. The room was quiet enough that Imani could hear the estate settling around them, the distant sounds of the house at night, the old sounds of a structure that had been standing for decades and would continue standing regardless of what happened inside it. Then Madame Seo said, in a voice so quiet it was almost below the threshold of speech, I saw the footage tonight. On those screens. She stopped, started again. I watched what I did, recorded, in front of another stop. I knew what I had done. I thought that I had reasons that were. She exhaled, a long, controlled exhale that was the closest thing to surrender Imani had ever witnessed from this woman. On the screen, it looked different than it felt when I was doing it. It usually does, Imani said. Madame Seo looked at her. That is not an absolution. No, Imani said. It isn't. They sat in the quiet of that together for a moment. Two women in a room at the end of a long night, the full weight of 2 years between them, neither of them pretending it was lighter than it was. I will not ask your forgiveness, Madame Seo said. I don't believe I've earned the right to ask for it. No, Imani agreed. Not yet. The word yet hung in the air between them. It was not a promise. It was not a map to anything guaranteed. It was simply a door left slightly ajar in a wall that could have been solid, and both women in the room understood exactly what it was and what it wasn't, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Imani stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress, the same black dress she had worn into the assembly hall 2 hours ago, the dress that had been present for the reckoning, and was now present for this smaller, harder, quieter thing. I'm going to build something in the greenhouse, she said. A workspace and a meeting center for the women in my humanitarian program. Some of them are going to come here, to this estate, for planning sessions and supported retreats. She looked at Madame Seo steadily. This is my home. The programs I run are part of this home. That's not a negotiation. Madame Seo held her gaze. I understand. Good, Imani said. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, not because she had something more to say, but because the moment asked for a pause, and she had learned to honor the moments that asked for that. She turned back once. Madame Seo was still seated, her hands in her lap, her silver-white hair loose around her face, looking at the space between the chairs, at the low table, at the spot where Imani had been sitting. She looked like a woman doing an inventory of her life from a particular vantage point that she had never occupied before. And the inventory was not going well, but she was doing it anyway, which was more than a lot of people managed. Imani said, He loves you. That hasn't changed. But love doesn't cover everything. You know that now. She left. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall outside the door, the same posture she'd held 8 months ago in a different hallway after a different wound, and she breathed. In, out. The air in the corridor was cool and neutral and entirely her own. Then she walked to the main bedroom. Kang Woo was there. He was standing at the window in the dark, jacket off, shirt untucked, looking out at the estate grounds the way he sometimes looked out at things he was still processing. He turned when she came in. He took in her face, her posture, the particular quality of her composure, and she watched him read it all before she said a word. You went to her, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Why? She sat on the edge of the bed. Because I heard her, and because I decided a long time ago, before all of this, before this house and this family, that I was going to be someone who doesn't walk past things because they're inconvenient or painful or complicated. She looked at him. That's who I was when you met me. I'm not giving that up because of what's happened here. He came and sat beside her on the bed. Not immediately. There was a pause that contained the specific movement of a man who is absorbing something and arriving at where she is before he closes the distance. He sat, and his shoulder was against hers, and they were both looking at the middle distance of the room for a moment before either of them spoke again. She's still my mother, he said. I know. What happened tonight doesn't change that. I need you to... Kang Wu. She turned to face him. I know. I have always known that. It's one of the reasons I didn't tell you for 2 years, because I could not stand the thought of being the thing that severed that. She held his eyes. I'm not trying to take her from you. I'm trying to make it possible for all of this to eventually be something other than a wound. He looked at her for a long time. In the low light of the bedroom, with his jacket off and his face unguarded in the way it only was in private, he looked younger than he did in the assembly hall. Not diminished, clarified. The way people look when the professional architecture comes down and what's underneath is simply a person who is tired and has done something hard and is sitting beside someone he trusts. She'll have to do the work, he said. I'm not going to manage her back into good standing. I know that too. It could take a long time. Most real things do, she said. He exhaled. Then he reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with the deliberateness of a gesture being performed for significance. Just his hand closing around hers in the ordinary, unannounced way of two people who have been touching each other long enough that it has stopped requiring intention. They sat like that for a while. Hyunja called me, he said after a while. She looked at him. When? While you were in the hall. She left a message. She didn't try to argue or negotiate. She said she needed time. He paused. She said she wasn't sure she fully understood what she'd been part of. Whether she'd been following our mother's lead for so long that she'd stopped checking whether she agreed with where it was going. A beat. I don't know if that's true or if it's the first revision of the story, but I'm going to let it sit before I decide. That's fair, Amani said. She's your sister. She stood in a garden outside a greenhouse and talked about whether you were crying inside it. Yes, Amani said. She did. She was quiet for a moment. And in 5 years, if she has done the work and proven what she says she means, I might be able to sit across a table from her without feeling that. But right now I feel it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I don't want you to pretend otherwise, he said. Good. They sat in the quiet of the room, and outside the estate was dark and still, and the reckoning that had happened in the assembly hall was already beginning its work in the world. The 61 witnesses carrying it back into the network, the legal documentation executing through his team's overnight processes, Jisoo in a hotel room in the wrong district calculating the dimensions of what had landed on her and finding no clean exits. Amani thought about Jisoo. She thought about the greenhouse, the voice through the glass door, the specific pleasure in that voice when it said, "Let her." She thought about what it would take to eventually set that down. Not forgive, not erase, but set down. She didn't know the timeline. She was honest enough with herself to admit she didn't know if the timeline ended in her lifetime. But she also knew that Jisoo was now operating without the infrastructure that had made her dangerous. The Kang network, the business holdings, the territory, all of it removed. A person stripped of the resources that enabled their cruelty is a different problem than a person at the center of power with those resources intact. Still a problem, potentially, but a different one. Jisoo, she said. Being handled, Kang Wu said. The people she fed information to, 3 of them are business contacts, 2 are society connections, 1 is a journalist who runs a column in a financial publication. He paused. My team is meeting with each of them over the next week, correcting the record, with documentation. The journalist will receive the footage summary and the legal record of tonight's proceedings, along with a clear statement of what the Kang family's position is regarding Mrs. Seo. His voice was even. The story Jisoo built is going to be dismantled with the same level of precision she used to build it. That's already in motion. Imani nodded. She thought about the narrative Jisoo had been constructing, the unstable foreign woman, the cultural mismatch, the liability, the careful months of feeding the right details to the right people. A story built on the assumption that Kang Woo would eventually absorb it, that the cumulative weight of planted doubt would do the work that direct opposition couldn't. The story was wrong about its central premise. It had assumed that Seo Kang-woo's attention could be managed, that a man who had built an empire on the accurate reading of information could be fed inaccurate information indefinitely and not notice. It had underestimated him, and it had underestimated her. "There's one more thing," Kang-woo said. She waited. "Rena." He said the name carefully. She knew. Not everything, but she was present for enough of it, and she complied with enough of the directives that she's been... He stopped. "She's been carrying that. I think she's been carrying it for a long time." Imani thought about Rena at the doorway of her office, eyes on the floor, delivering messages with the posture of someone who is also, in a different register, a victim of the situation she's been placed inside. 23 years old, employed by a family with enough power to end her career, asked to carry messages that she understood were wrong. "She's not responsible," Imani said. "She was caught between things that were too big for her to push back against. I know, I'm not planning to..." He paused. "I wanted to know what you thought before I spoke with her." "Tell her she still has her position," Imani said. "Tell her it's done, and then let her decide if she wants to stay." "You think she'll stay?" Imani remembered Rena's voice saying, "Mrs. Seo," with the deliberate emphasis of a young woman using the only tool available to her. "Yes," she said. "I think she'll stay." He nodded. The night moved around them. At some point, Imani became aware that she was exhausted in the structural way, the bone-level, marrow-deep exhaustion that follows long effort. Not the exhaustion of a single hard day, but the exhaustion of 2 years of sustained endurance finally receiving the news that it can stop. Her body was beginning to understand that the emergency was over, and it was presenting her with the accumulated bill for everything she'd spent managing it. She lay back against the pillows. Kang-woo remained sitting for a while longer. She could feel him there, the specific weight of his presence, that particular gravity she had oriented toward since Chicago, since a charity function table and a man who had read her proposal with complete attention and said, "Tell me what you need." She said, without opening her eyes, "I need to call my mother." He was quiet for a moment. "Now?" "Tomorrow morning, Chicago time." She paused. "She's been worried. She doesn't know details, but she knows me, and she's known for months that something was wrong. I need to tell her it's better." "Is it better?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way he asked things when he wanted the true answer rather than the managed one. She considered it. Better was a complicated word for the current situation. Better than what had been, certainly. Better than the trajectory it had been on. But not uncomplicated, not clean, not the better that means finished and healed and resolved without remainder. The better that means the worst of it is over, and what remains is real and manageable and worth the effort of managing. "Yes," she said, "it's better." She heard him exhale slowly. Then he lay down beside her, and the room settled into the specific quiet of two people at the end of something large, and the estate was quiet around them, and outside the windows the grounds were dark. She didn't sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and she thought about the greenhouse, about what it would become. She had a clear image of it already. The work tables along the south wall, the meeting area in the center where the existing plant beds were now, the climate control system that would make it usable year-round. The women from the Hanoi program coming here, women who had survived discrimination and displacement, and the specific violence of being treated as though their lives mattered less than other people's comfort. Sitting in that space, doing the work that would make other women's lives more navigable. She thought about the fact that the room where she had cried alone, where Jisoo had stood outside the glass and said, "Let her," was going to become a room where the work of repair happened. Not because it was poetic, not because she was making a point, but because it was the right use of a good space, and she was done letting other people's cruelty claim territory in her life. It was hers. She was taking it back. 6 weeks later, the greenhouse conversion was completed. The work tables were clean pine, built by a craftsman from the city who had come recommended by director Yoon's wife, a detail that told Amani something about the reorientation of the network's social calculations that she found both practical and quietly satisfying. The climate control was calibrated for year-round use. The central space had a large circular table that sat 12, surrounded by the careful relocation of the most significant orchid specimens to the perimeter walls, where they continued to grow in the increased humidity of a room that was now also being breathed in by people doing meaningful work. Deanna came for the opening. She flew in from Chicago with 2 colleagues from the Hanoi Initiative and stood in the doorway of the converted greenhouse on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, looking at the space, looking at Amani, and said nothing for a moment that was full. Then she said, "You look like yourself." "I feel like myself," Amani said. And it was true in the specific way that things are true when they have been earned rather than simply maintained. The truth of a person who has passed through something and come out the other side not unchanged but intact, still recognizably who they were and also something harder and cleaner in the places where they'd been tested. They worked for 3 days. The Hanoi program documentation, the field visit planning, the resource allocation for the second phase of the Displaced Women's Initiative. Kang-woo appeared on the second evening, shook hands with Deanna with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that this woman's opinion of him mattered to Amani and who respected that, and sat for 40 minutes listening to the program overview before asking 2 specific questions that demonstrated he had been listening more closely than his silence suggested. Deanna said nothing until he left. Then she looked at Amani and said, "Okay." "Just okay," Amani said. "He asked the right questions," Deanna said. "I'll give him that." Amani smiled. It was the full kind, the kind that reaches the eyes. Madame Seo did not appear during the 3 working days, but on the morning of the 4th day, when Deanna and the colleagues had already left for the airport and Amani was alone in the greenhouse doing the final organization of the documentation systems, the door opened. Madame Seo stood in the entrance of the space that had been her son's greenhouse and was now something entirely different, and she looked at what it had become. The tables, the files, the photographs of field sites pinned to the east wall, the notes in 3 languages, the 12-person circular table, and the orchids relocated to the perimeter walls and continuing, unbothered, to bloom. She was dressed as she usually was, composed, complete, her hair pinned, her posture its own authority. But she stood in the doorway rather than entering, which was different from how she had always moved through this estate, and Amani registered that. "This is what you do," Madame Seo said. It wasn't quite a question. "Part of it," Amani said. She kept working, sorting a file, closing a folder. Not dismissively, but because she was a person in the middle of her work, and the work didn't pause for audiences. "The field work happens in country. This is the planning and coordination." Madame Seo looked at the photographs on the east wall. Amani watched her look at them. At the faces of women in field conditions, in displacement sites, in the careful documentation of lives that had been interrupted by forces larger than their own choices. Madame Seo looked at those photographs for a long time. "How many women?" she said. "In the current program? Directly? About 400. The downstream impact of the policy work is harder to quantify." Amani put down the folder. "Probably several thousand over the life of the initiative." Madame Seo was still looking at the wall. "My husband," she said after a moment, "built what he built because his mother had nothing. When he was a child, she had nothing and no one helped her, and he watched that and he decided—" She stopped. Her jaw moved slightly, adjusting something. "He always said the only power worth having was power you used to make other people's position better. That it was meaningless otherwise." A pause. "I forgot that. Somewhere in the years after he died, I forgot the difference between protecting what he built and simply protecting power for its own sake." Amani stood very still. "That is not an absolution either," Madame Seo said. She turned to look at Amani directly. "I know what it is and what it isn't." "I know," Amani said. They looked at each other across the length of the greenhouse, across the 12-person table and the work files and the photographs and the orchids and 2 years of what had been done and the uncertain long road of what came after. "Is there anything," Madame Seo said, and stopped. Tried again. "Is there a way that I could be useful to what you're doing?" Her voice was careful, not humble. Madame So was not a woman who did humble, and forcing it would have been worse than the alternative. Careful, precise, asking a real question. I have connections to certain policy circles, to certain funding networks, things that might be relevant to this kind of work. Amani looked at her for a long moment. She thought about Jisoo's voice. She thought about the beige dress. She thought about 14 dinner tables and servants redirected, and a family portrait with an empty space where she should have been standing. She thought about a man who had built an empire because he watched his mother have nothing and decided that power existed to change that for other people. She thought about the fact that Madame So was standing in a room she had been excluded from, asking to contribute to work she had spent 2 years treating as irrelevant, using a voice stripped of its usual architecture. And the question was real, imperfect, insufficient, inadequate to the weight of what had preceded it, but real. Not yet, Amani said. Madame Seo nodded once. But ask me again, Amani said. In 6 months. Show me that this is something you mean and not something you're performing, and ask me again. Madame Seo held her gaze for a long moment. Then she inclined her head, the same gesture Director Yoon had used in the assembly hall, the same precise motion that in this context, in this room, carried its own full weight. She left. Amani stood alone in the greenhouse for a while after the door closed. She stood among the orchids and the work files and the photographs of women who had survived things larger than themselves, and she breathed in the humid air of the room that had once been the place where she cried alone, and she felt the specific texture of a life that has come through something and arrived somewhere that is not the same as where it started, but is, after everything, worth having. She was still standing there when Kang Woo found her. He had been looking for her. She could tell from the way he moved through the door with the particular purposefulness of someone who has checked 2 other locations. He stopped when he saw her face. He read it the way he always read her, completely, efficiently, arriving at the substance of it without requiring an explanation. She was here, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And? And it was a beginning, Amani said, not a resolution. A beginning. He crossed the greenhouse to her. He stood beside her and looked at the photographs on the east wall, at the faces his mother had looked at, the documentation of the work his wife had been doing in the years he had been building other things. I owe you, he said, not in the register of debt, in the register of a man who has looked at a full picture and understood where the gaps in it were and what they cost the person he was supposed to be protecting. You came home, she said. You watched the footage. You stood up in that room. She turned to face him. That's not nothing. It should have been sooner. Yes, she said. It should have. She held his eyes. We'll both have to live with what that cost. That's part of it. He looked at her. The full, complete attention she had learned to receive without flinching, because it asked something of you. That attention, it required you to be as present as it was. He looked at her the way he had looked at her once across a table in Chicago, in a room full of people doing good work, when he had first understood that this woman was someone he was going to have to know. Come with me, he said. Where? I want to show you something. He took her hand, the ordinary, unprefaced closing of his hand around hers, and he walked her out of the greenhouse, through the east garden, along the stone path where Jisoo and Hyunja had once stood outside a glass door, and across the grounds in the early spring light until they reached the far edge of the east garden where the estate's oldest structure stood, a stone pavilion that had been part of the original property, predating the mansion itself, covered now in the early green of climbing plants beginning their seasonal return. Inside the pavilion, a table had been set. Not elaborately. Simply. 2 cups, a pot of tea, the quiet arrangement of someone who had done this without staff, without ceremony, without any infrastructure except the intention behind it. Amani looked at the table, then at him. I used to come here, he said, when I was a child, when the house was too loud. He said it without performance, the plain statement of a man sharing something private. My father built this part of the garden. He said quiet was something you had to build deliberately, that it didn't come to you. She looked at the stone walls of the pavilion, the climbing green, the simple table. It's beautiful. It's yours too, he said. All of it. Every part of this place. It's yours as much as it is mine, and I should have made that unambiguous from the beginning, and I didn't, and I'm telling you now." She stood in the spring light of the pavilion looking at the man she had chosen to love, knowing what he was and choosing him anyway, knowing the weight of his world and carrying part of it anyway, knowing that he was not simple or easy or uncomplicated, and that the life built alongside him would never be simple or easy or uncomplicated. And she felt in that moment the full weight of what endurance had been for. Not for the endurance itself, not because suffering was a value, but because she was still here, still herself. Still the woman who knocked on doors she could have walked past. Still the woman who ran programs for 400 women and planned to reach 4,000. Still the woman her mother had made her. Still the woman Seo Kang-woo had looked at across a table in Chicago and decided he could not leave without knowing. She sat down at the table in the pavilion. He sat across from her and poured the tea. A plain, unpretentious motion, the motion of a man doing a simple thing without requiring it to mean more than it meant. And he set the cup in front of her, and she picked it up, and the spring light moved across the pavilion floor in the early afternoon way that light moves when it is unobstructed, and the estate was quiet around them. They sat there for a long time. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much in that moment that required words. The words had been spent in assembly halls and dark hallways and West Wing rooms and greenhouse doorways, and what remained now was something quieter and more durable than words. What remained was this: two people at a table, in a pavilion, in the spring, tea going cool between them, the estate stretching in every direction, full of the complicated, imperfect, unresolved, continuing business of being a family that has survived what it has survived and is deciding, day by day, what it intends to become. Amani drank her tea. She looked at the climbing green on the stone walls, the early season leaves unfurling in the light. She thought about the greenhouse. She thought about Hanoi. She thought about her mother in Chicago, and Deanna's voice saying, "You look like yourself," and the 12-person circular table, and the 400 women in the current program, and the thousands in the years to come. She thought about a beige dress on a bed and a note that said, "Appropriate for a guest," and she thought about how far that note now was from the truth of her life in this place, and she let the distance between those two things settle in her chest like something finally put down. She was not a guest. She had never been a guest. It had taken 2 years and 8 months of footage and 61 witnesses and one assembly hall reckoning and one hard conversation in a darkened suite and one beginning, imperfect and uncertain, between a woman who had made serious mistakes and a woman who had decided that walking past certain doors was not something she was willing to do. It had taken all of that. But she was here, at a table in the spring, with her husband across from her and her work in the greenhouse, and her name spoken correctly in every room of this estate by people who now understood what it meant to say it wrong. She was here, and she was herself, and the story of how she had stayed that way, the whole complicated, costly, unromantic, ultimately true story of it, was hers. She kept it. End.